She has recently authored 2 chapters in the 2021 IGI publication on this topic in the Handbook of Research on K-12 blended and virtual learning through the i²Flex classroom model. Today, she is giving a talk on inquiry-based language learning. Please help me welcome Christina.
Thank you so much for this warm welcome. I'm really excited to be here, and I really thank you so much for this invitation. I'm so honored, very excited, and just to give a quick background, because I've grown up quite multilingually in a multicultural background, so I've always been rather curious child and person, but one of the things that I have really grown to really appreciate and to admire so much is when the students, my students, are the ones asking the questions in the classroom, which has really kind of got me thinking. You know, I realized the high school students were not asking as many questions as the younger ones. And I also, before moving to Greece, I also was able to teach in the community college level as well. And just notice in general, okay, I was always wanting more engagement, let's say more questions from the students. And so through that, I've really been able to engage in through my action research with both at our school where I'm teaching now, as well as through my graduate program with in my Ph.D. program. So in this program, I've really been investigating curiosity, inquiry-based learning, and really how we can successfully engage students to ask more questions, right? To spark curiosity and motivation for learning about the language, because it's not just the language, but it's the language and the culture together. They go hand in hand. And if they're learning about the language, they're learning about the people who speak the language, and they're learning how to actually build more intercultural communicative awareness, understanding, fostering, and even empowering the sense of connection to the wider community and global citizenship, hopefully. So as we know, you know, when students are interested, when they're motivated, when the material that's presented to them is relevant to their interests, in other words, when there's a will, there's a way. So this is really that has inspired the last, I don't know how many years in looking for different methods that work for how to actually get those students to ask more questions. Now so objectives for today in this talk, what I'm going to be going into a little bit about what inquiry-based learning is, and design thinking methodology as well. And also vocabulary and inquiry, how we can actually engage those. And I'll be sharing some further resources as well. So I just first wanted to ask you all to just actually reflect, whether you're a student or an educator, but when you're in a classroom, who is it that you feel does most of the questioning? Is it the teachers or is it the students? Think about it. And I think you may be surprised at some of the answers. Every time I give this talk or something similar on this, it's really something that I think most of us are kind of surprised at what we think is the answer to what is actually the answer. If anyone knows, by the way, of a really cool app called Equity Maps, it's on the iPad. You can actually record a classroom conversation, a classroom lesson, and actually see percentage-wise who's doing most of the talking. So I do recommend for you guys to check that out. So moving on, I do want you guys to think, okay, so we're in 21st century, we're 2022 now, and really, you know, classrooms have shifted. I mean, they're not, they are student-centered. It's no longer shifting towards student-centered. They are there already. And so we really need to be encouraging more of the students to take a more active role in their learning, right? We don't want them to be passive learners. We need them to be engaging and architects to help them become architects of their own learning. So 21st century education really sees innovative teaching methods, letting go of these grammar-driven curriculum programs while embracing more content-based, cognitively stimulating tasks, connecting the language learners to the language when communicating across the global world surrounding them. And we know that inquiry-based learning and design thinking methodologies, they're relatively new pedagogical approaches to language learning. We hear about them in maths and sciences, but let's also give credit to the languages. So we know that there's potential to promote content-based instruction that leads to that grammatical understanding. It leads and furthers the vocabulary development, oral proficiency, as well as intercultural awareness and competence through higher order thinking skills. So when learners are willingly, they're attentive, they're showing curiosity and interest, they are actively learning. And so they're progressing linguistically as well. So if the student is asking the question, him or her or themselves, it's much more likely for them to actually remember the answer to that question rather than if the teacher were to have asked it. So I think, when I first started this whole inquiry research, this was one of the first books I read, which I can't recommend enough. Warren Berger, More Beautiful Question. And he really discusses this art of questioning. And he, through different research, he has found that teachers really tend to monopolize that right to question. And indeed, it is just amazing how research has really shown that kids reach their peak of questioning right around the age of 4 or 5 years old. Well, think to yourselves, what happens in a child's life at that time? They're entering the classroom environment, right? Up until that point, they've been number one in their family's household, right? They're always asking questions, but there's only 1 or 2, maybe 3 people answering them, or the family. But then they enter this environment, and all of a sudden they're surrounded by a whole bunch of other little people and a few big people. And so the audience in front of which that their questions are asking, it has multiplied exponentially, as does the risk to ask those questions. So we're really experiencing a need to shift towards not just student-centered, but also fostering that safe and nurturing environment that encourages questions from the students, no matter what age group. And I'm going to get back to that in a minute, so that they can also be engaged and motivated to learn. Now, inquiry, what is inquiry, right? I mean, we know inquiry is basically asking questions, it's curiosity. But with regards to education, it's more than that. So we know that the approach actually of inquiry-based learning really has its grounding in constructivist theories that are stemming from progressive, forward-thinking educational philosophies of John Dewey and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example. And they emphasize the learner's contribution to meaning and learning through both the individual and social activities, so experience. So in short, it's not just, knowledge is not simply out there waiting to be discovered, much like curriculum waiting to be covered, but it's more rather than it's being created from their own questioning and interpretations and reinterpretations in light of their new experiences. So in more simplistic terms, the learner constructs and builds knowledge. Now, depending on what research you are reading with regards to 21st century skills, there's usually 4, and where we're trying to build curious language learners in this world. So what is missing, right? We know, okay, yes, we've got communication, we've got collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity. But if we actually want to take it a step further and really think about what is missing when we're trying to open the dialogue, we want to start having people wonder more about what they're learning about, the cultures, being aware of those cultures, what is actually missing. So I've gone ahead and actually added 2, since we can't really have these 4 without a curiosity and cultural understanding, because they really go hand in hand with the constant change and adaptation that we're faced with inside and outside of the classroom. So after all, our purpose is to prepare them for the future, not remain stuck in traditional methods of the past. It's this idea of change that a historian, Yuval Harari, ascertains in his book, his education, one chapters on education, 21 Lessons of the 21st Century, that educational objectives should be focused more on soft skills and general purpose life skills, such as learning how to deal with those constant changes that are facing us literally every day, inside and outside the classroom, right? So I've gone ahead and added a few C's to this list. And in order for any learning or discussion, inquiry, collaboration, and effective communication to take place in any language and between languages, we need to first establish that culture of listening to each other, free of judgment or ridicule, so that students can really engage in voicing their own curiosities and learn out loud in a safe environment. So let us not forget that learning a language is a highly risky task. They are often asked to reproduce grammatical perfection with limited focus on how the grammar that they're learning is actually applicable to their real world, to their use in a future context. So on this culture of listening, once it has been established, it in turn leads to that culture of understanding and awareness. And so when we're using an inquiry-based method, or to engage or collaborate with another student, virtually or not, being aware of those differences first is really quite crucial to actually effectively collaborate and communicate in a meaningful way. So our goal then is actually not to just turn their minds on and engage, but it's to really be active with the language. And we all know that, you know, as language educators, we don't want a silent classroom. That's not our goal. We want our students to gain proficiency. So this really takes speaking practice and getting things wrong in order to get things right. Language classes, they really need to be more interactive, innovative. Students learning a foreign language are, you know, they're concurrently learning about that culture, its belief systems, its cultural perspectives. And we're facilitators in this language classroom. And we have the power to create that environment where learning and languages are celebrated, diversity is accepted, and students, and they're valued. And students can really get to express themselves openly without that fear of judgment. So this is where the inquiry-based methods come in. So I'm going to talk about a couple different methods to give you a little bit of perspective here. And one of the biggest ones I really like to lead with is the QFT. Now, here we have a picture of Rodin's Le Penseur, right? The thinker. So what does the thinker actually have to do with QFT? Well, it's exactly what this is all about. It's a process. It's called a question formulation technique. And what's really, really interesting about this and how cool it is that it actually stemmed from parents, adults, okay? A conversation with parents. It was developed by the Right Question Institute, which is out of Boston, Massachusetts. And it's taught through the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And it's a simple yet very powerful strategy that actually leads students to their own learning through questioning. Now, it actually developed from a study that was done with parents from low-income areas around Boston. And these were parents that were uninvolved with their students' education. They were uninvolved because they weren't coming to parent-teacher events. They didn't know what kinds of questions to ask, so they felt embarrassed, and they didn't want to feel embarrassed. So they opted out completely. They just didn't attend. So they were taught this QFT method, and then they became more confident. They were more active in their children's education, and the children ended up receiving more of the support that they needed. It's amazing. It's amazing what this simple technique, but it's just so powerful what it can do for all ages. Now, in this QFT process, the teachers are facilitators, and students become motivated and engaged, and they're taking the lead, and they are becoming architects of their own learning. And I really like to, in the language classroom, I like to use QFT to introduce a cultural lesson. So what they do is we start with a question focus. Now, it could be a picture. It could be a question, it could be a statement, it could be a song, it could be a video, it can be whatever you want it to be, but it's something that you want them to actually focus on. And you basically give them time to explore that. You give them a few minutes silent time to actually just explore that. It could also be artifacts. So when I do Data Dead, for example, we'll have different artifacts around the room or different pictures if it's virtual. It might be infographics and things like that. And I'll show you some examples. So for example, in my ESL classroom, we have a lot of Asian students, and we have off for Thanksgiving, being an American school, but we're in Greece. They have no clue what Thanksgiving is or why we have off. They know it has something to do with the turkey, but that's it. So we do a lesson on it. We're talking, we're discussing this, but how do we do this? So I'll have different pictures, for example. First thing that comes to mind, there is no right or wrong. They don't stop writing until time is up, usually about 5 minutes. Afterwards, I ask them to go back and change their statements, if there were any statements, into questions. Questions into statements. Change the questions that they have to, if they're open, to closed, if they're closed, to open. And of course, sometimes we have to revisit what is an open question, what's a closed-ended question. The point is they have to write every question exactly as it's asked. There is no judgment on, there's no judgment on what kind of question is being asked. Because really one of the central, the most important rules of QFT is to acknowledge that all contributions are equal. In other words, we're not going to say, oh, that's a great question, but rather, Johnny raises an interesting point. QFT emphasizes that there's no right or wrong to the question or wondering. So we're not going to give value to those kinds of things. We are going to be objective. Now, you've probably heard over and over how creativity is just so stifled by borders and limitations. And each question has a value, just as each student has value. So let's not limit our students to judgments on answers, comments, or questions. Let them flow freely. And it's not a competition. It's not about asking the most questions or the best questions. As long as each group has come up with at least as many questions as group members, this is enough. So this is a collaborative activity. Now, in groups, they're coming up with their questions. So here's an ESL example. Here is one for the Data Dead that I've done with Spanish classes. And if this is when it was done in class. So this particular poster board is from a Data Dead one. You can see that the students have, with different color markers, they've written different questions. You can see that they've gone and labeled the questions as to closed or open. And then you can also see, so the next step is actually, once they do this collaboratively, they decide on which are the most important questions out of all of the different questions. Now, you can see, let's see, you can also see, let me go next. Here's another one that was done while we were virtual. And this is also a way to, this was using Jamboard. It's also something we've used for our TED Ed, or to students giving TED Ed talks where they're exploring their ideas. So the same type of this QFT adapted, let's say, and this was the central focus, the question focus that a student had come up with, and what they were, these are other students and their reactions to it. So it's really, really interesting. So here are the actual steps of the QFT. Once they finish their list, their brainstorm of questions, they discuss together which questions they feel or agree are the most important. And so they can go look back, they discuss, they choose the top 5. And then, so that, they're thinking, they're reflecting, they're collaborating. And then once they have their list groups share out those questions between the groups, you can see which ones overlap and what the other groups have come up with. The last process is for them to investigate the answers to the questions that they came up with. So once they do this, again, in groups or individually, it's all time dependent. Maybe it's a homework assignment. They then present their findings in the target language, right? Depending on the level, of course. Now, as with any new learning, reflection can really be a powerful assessment tool as students are really stretching those metacognitive muscles, and they're making connections and they're expressing what they've learned through the process. So they're facilitating reflection, and this taps into their intrinsic motivation, leading change as students really become more empowered to become more critical and reflective thinkers. And I really like to give them a short reflection, a period before I go on to fill in the gaps with my own, proceed with the own lesson that I've actually planned for them. But this also gives a really nice background for their understanding of what is their learning based on their own questions and wonderings. So just to recap, these are the steps. So they're first either on a Jamboard or poster paper, however you're doing it. Using a picture prompt or your question focus, they put their questions together, they categorize them, they discuss them, they will value them, and then they go off and research and investigate them. And then lastly, they reflect on it. Now, I have used Thanksgiving and Day to Dead as my examples, but I also use it, I really do a whole unit on music, especially with the Spanish classes. And so I'll have different instruments around the room that I picked up on my travels, or I may have them listen to different things that can also be a question focus. I'll play different styles of music, for example, and they're writing their questions based on the music that they hear. It could also be of different paintings or infographics, really, especially, okay, what are they calling it, Espanol or Castellano? It's really interesting to look at this and look, okay, what do they actually get out of this before I go in to explain it all? What is this telling us about Frida Kahlo? What do we know about her? What does this tell us about her? Who are these monkeys? I mean, did she live in the jungle? I mean, all kinds of, questions that they come up with that can actually start to be explored later, depending on where we want to go with it, which is also actually part of design thinking. Also, let's say you're talking about fiestas or celebrations in the cultural aspect. So looking at specific paintings like this one, talking about the quinceañera, for example, or any type of festival or festivity. But before you actually go in and talk about it, what do they know about it? What can they see from this? They're learning by example and also using artistic understanding as well. So this is actually looking at, in my ESL classes, we were looking at art through political language. And it was just so interesting for them to see and to be able to interpret, use these actually as pictures to look at. And what are their questions? What are they talking about? What do they have to say about this? Write a story about this. Okay. It's really, really interesting what they can come up with. Now you can see, of course, these are two different paintings or graffiti pieces by the same artist. And you can do the same thing. They're observing, just like they did with the artifacts before. They have, they're observing, what do they think? What do they know? What do they wonder? Okay, and then based on what they're wondering, okay, what's going to fuel the next part of our discussion in class? And I'm just going to show, this is something I did with my ESL classes last year, talking about, here's the flower thrower. Okay, they have two groups, for example, and you give the two groups a part of the picture. They haven't seen it together yet. And they actually answer some questions about it. What do they think? What is he throwing? What are these flowers? Are they flowers? What are they? Like, why is he masked? So then they come together and they actually look at the piece and they think about it, describe it, draw it. They share their thoughts, compare with the other group, they connect. And then, they actually think about, okay, their connection with their own neighborhood. Does it make them feel nice, angry, any other emotions? And thinking about other artists or other pieces of their own culture that, maybe that may be able to, they can raise awareness of. So many connections that our students made for this last year, especially with events that were going on in Greece. So it was really, really interesting for them to make that connection and understand from what we're learning in the language classroom to also to the community and that they're living in. And KWLQ, we all know what KWLQ is, or KWL is, but let's add the Q as well. Now that we know what we know, what questions do we have on what we know? So infographics, I mentioned them earlier, but you can, so many different things that can be used again as a QFT, as a question focus, having them, okay, what questions do they have about this? Let's think about this. Let's really, depending on the level of the classroom that you have, that you're in, that can really fuel what comes next. And I'm actually going to talk about with the SMART goals. I'll give you some more examples in a bit. Here's a really cool, I think hopefully everyone is familiar with Picasso's Guernica. This is a quick, you can search on YouTube 3D Guernica and you'll find this. It's a 3-minute video clip. It's the painting in 3D and it's set to classical music. It's a beautiful little video. The music is a bit somber. For students who have never learned about the history in the Spanish Civil War or Picasso or anything having to do with that, it's a really nice question focus to use as a QFT that opens up discussion and learning about the history, war, or anything related to that you may like to go into. So it's really, it's quite a powerful tool, and there's just so many different ways to use it. So I mentioned history earlier with Guernica. Again, think about if you were to put two different paintings up between, here we have Velázquez and Picasso version of Las Meninas. So just, even looking at this, of course, once you have been introducing, you've been doing QFT as a process, they are used to it. And it is something that really, you don't actually have to facilitate anymore. They know the process. They start asking the questions on their own, and you'll just see, it's amazing how much more that they actually, they just start, shooting questions out, and it really is driving the discussion. And this is really what we like to see. Now, as part of my action research at my school, alongside with my graduate school as well, I wanted to find out what my students actually thought of QFT. So I gave them a brief pre-survey before embarking on the lesson about Thanksgiving, for example, and then post-survey as well to get an understanding of what they learned from the process. I actually do this for each time. I'm always looking at comparisons. And it was so interesting to see that 88% of the students actually believe that students should be doing most of the questioning, thereby leading it. And 91% of the students were in agreement that learning culture contributed better to their linguistic and cultural understanding. So it was really, really eye-opening to see that, and refreshing as well. Now, as for the 12% that didn't agree, for example, that would indicate that maybe they haven't had enough exposure to inquiry-based learning methods or critical thinking strategies. Where they're in fact motivating their own learning through questioning. So maybe they need more examples of that. Now, I just wanted also to note that, the objective of any language teacher, it's not only to develop eventual fluent speakers, but also to encourage an environment where curious and therefore motivated minds would be able to see the relationship between culture, language, and humanities in general, contributing to their conscious global citizenship. Because that's really, it's not just, we can't separate language from culture. Now, as mentioned earlier, I do want also to point out that, how am I doing on time, by the way? Okay, I think it's 8 o'clock, right? It's 8 o'clock here, at least in Greece. Okay, so, great, thanks. So I also just want to point out, that in the classroom, I always have the question where it's permanently displayed, etc. But we also, we want to always make sure that students are always aware of the different questions, that they can always be invited and asked to learn about whatever it is they're learning about. So, of course, no matter what our unit is, the curriculum, whatever textbook, if we're following or whatever it is, there's always going to be those extra words that pop up that students want to know. What does that mean? How do you say this, etc. And it may or may not have to do with the unit, right? It may or may not have to do it, but does it matter? Doesn't matter if the question that they're asking has absolutely nothing to do with the particular unit. Does it actually matter? They're asking a question about a word to say something, to express in the language. And that's what we want. That is our ultimate goal. So, why not fill in those blanks? So they know in my classroom, they know that they're to ask each other or look things up if I'm not going to answer that, especially if I've already told them before. But basically, all of these things of how do you say, how to remember all the words that we come across, these are valuable words. They're coming from them. So there's lots of different tools nowadays, Quizlet, Quizzes, WordWall. I'm sure there's more, but I have, ever since Quizlet came out, I kind of got hooked on it, and it does so many things, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So you can, I think there's over 20 languages now that Quizlet is available in, and it is, what I really like about it is that students and teachers can create sets with it. So it's not only a teacher tool, but it is, I always actually encourage my students to be able to use it for all of their classes, to organize a vocabulary for their flashcards, etc. Now, building on and using a widening vocabulary is really, an essential component to language acquisition. So it's a necessity, right, for language learners to express themselves adequately, leading to proficiency in their language. So just as language learning is constant and not limited to the school day, teachers want to find ways to expand on what words and students learn and use in class. Now, in a fun and interactive way, so that they can then practice their use of the language outside of the classroom, right? After all, we learn best by doing. Now, we always have, those set of words, but okay, let's not limit ourselves to those. They're listening to music in the language probably. They are watching movies with subtitles or not, whatever, but they are definitely engaged and actually exposed to the language as well, outside of what we are providing for them. So, it gives them an easy access to actually keep track of these words using Quizlet, for me at least. Now, what do I do? So for every month, I keep a list of extra words that are asked in class as a set on Quizlet. And then I may assign a glossary, for example, with a minimum of 2 to 5 words per minute. So it used to be glossary. Now I think I use, more now that Padlet has become popular, I also use Padlet for this, so they can also post their questions or their sentences on Padlet. I can assign Quizlet to practice the words. They can do the words with spelling practice flashcards. There's gaming, there's learning them by listening to it as well. And then I quiz them as well on the words at the end of the month. They can also create a story with the words, and you can publish the story, bind it, and have it in the classroom. Or of course, this could be virtual. Here is an example of some of the sentences for the ESL students who were using on the Padlet that they end up getting quizzed on later at the end. So really, depending on the level and depending on what you want, they can write full and complete sentences using the words, and they're not to use definitions. That's my one rule, but they do need to use the word in context. Usually by the end of the month, they've accumulated between 20 and 30 words. So it's a good amount to have a quiz. And because we are reviewing them constantly, the overlap is general, not as much. So they're using them. It's not just learning a word to use to be assessed on, but they're using them, which is really what's the most important. Storyboardthat.com is another tool that I like to use, where they can come up with their own comics or stories to write using their lists. And they really get a kick, out of being able to read each other's work, read each other's stories that they can come up with. And it's really just, this process of vocabulary building is just another way of one aspect of how inquiry-based learning through vocabulary, it's really, curiosity is leading those learners, again, towards their own learning and agency. And of course, I always give them surveys to find out, do they like this? How do they like this? What's it speaking to them? So action research, and finding out that 30% of their student performance was definitely increasing over the monthly vocab list, 90% decrease in the number of repeated words. They showed an increase in language acquisition overall. And if I can move this, it says, yeah, that they responded that Quizlet helped them equally with both speaking and writing when it comes to vocabulary acquisition and language learning. And I have to say that to me, that's like the cherry on top. I mean, I can't get better than that. So I was very pleased, and that's why I continue to use Quizlet for that. I also want to show you some of the, these are directly from the students, some of their own reflections on Quizlet and how it is helpful for them. I'll let you read that without interruption. So, you know, reading over the comments combined with the overall increase in the proficiency as a whole in the classroom, I can really say that it's, you know, okay, it's not only taking Quizlet for what it is, but it's taking it 2 or 3 steps further than that, and using, you know, further than its original possibilities, and really showing how it can have really positive results in language proficiency and ownership of the language. And they're really, you know, they're leading their own learning again, which is also an example of design thinking. So, which is next? And here we have design thinking is similar to, let's say, project-based learning in a way, where they're using all the 4 skills of language acquisition. So it's reading, writing, speaking, listening, and they're highly flexible and adaptable. And it's an emergent discipline, again, in the languages, that really fosters innovation through applying principles from the world of design to other fields. It says bottom-up concept, and it really promotes this innovation and creativity. I really like to use this because I get feedback from the students. What is it that they want to do? How can they actually feel where are we going to go with this particular unit? I mean, if we want to learn about something, where do we want to go with it? They're in control of their learning with design thinking, because it's really empowering them with choices, feeling valued as participants in their own learning process. And it's providing opportunities for them to choose assignments based on their own learning styles, like choice boards, for example. And it really offers personalized learning experiences for each student. And it emphasizes, of course, student inquiry and student-driven learning, incorporating all of the 21st century skills that were mentioned earlier. And of course, it can lead to the performance-based assessments, which includes the following pedagogical tasks I'll show you for cultural and linguistic learning. We have, for example, for the lower level, like, I guess this would be like for the beginning or the intermediate levels, having, and then also, for example, with the upper levels. So if I, for example, let's say I have, I did this actually with an intermediate class recently, where we were tackling the school community. So they had in their beginners courses, they had already, you know, learned the basics about school and activities, etc. But now, now we were taking it a bit step further, and I told them, listen, we're on a campus, a school campus. And I said, listen, I want you to imagine that you are going to give a tour to prospective students for the school, but in Spanish or in Chinese or in whatever language you're teaching. And what do you need to know to be able to do that? So they start thinking about how to say certain things and realizing the gaps that they have. And okay, so we need to learn these verbs, for example. We need to learn these prepositions, let's say. We need to learn how to use, you know, these constructions, etc. So the students are actually telling me, okay, we're going to do this, but let's make it happen. How are we going to make it happen? That's design thinking, right? It's getting them to actually say, okay, what do we need to know to be able to do this? And how are we going to get there? And of course, you know, similar projects can be for all of the other types of units. In the upper levels, for example, environment, I think I put it here, although it could also easily go with the upper level. Actually, something I did with my upper level Spanish students, they're more like at let's say a B1 or B2 level. So they had to choose a SMART goal Actually, we were working with the Sustainable Development Goals, which I think many schools are focusing on these days. And they had to choose, we had done a unit on environment. So I asked them to choose one of these goals that resonated with them, something that was important to them. And then they had to actually design a SMART goal and present it. They had to actually think of something that was actually doable and attainable, and using conditional, future, and subjunctive tenses, present it and do it, and actually present the SMART goal, and then hopefully actually carry it out. But the whole thing was, this is what I intend to do, and it is doable. So this is also getting them also to think a little bit more outside the box and how I can help my community through language. So it was actually quite a successful project for them. And it was really, really cool to see what they came up with. Now, many of us, okay, we have textbooks we have to follow, how are we going to incorporate? What are we, how can we do this? Is this an add-on or not? I mean, we don't want to have to do more than what we're already asked to do. So, inquiry-based learning doesn't have to be instead of, but rather it's integrated within whatever curriculum that you have set. And you may decide that you want to try design thinking, for example, for one unit and see how it goes. You may want to integrate a QFT for one lesson, and the next time you may decide you don't have time to do a full QFT lesson, but you still want to actually use some of those questions for the kids that they have about a particular topic. So as with any new approach and method, start with one, see how it goes, and see what works for you. Right? And after every assessment, I always like to get feedback from the students to fill out a little reflection describing what they know about certain topic, what was not asked that they still want to know, and along with questions that they still have, for example. And is there, something that was discovered along the way that maybe didn't fulfill their curious itch? So this is really valuable feedback for me as the educator, so that I know what I can work on in the future as possible. Now, kids have a lot of questions, right? But it's nice to have an organized place for those questions. So whether it be a word wall, maybe it is on a Padlet, whatever it may be. But basically, we want to make sure that they have the environment that's there where they get to ask the questions anonymously or not, just to make sure that at least the questions are being asked. Starting off always a class, maybe like with I see, I notice, I wonder is also a nice warm up for a class. Maybe start with a painting, an image worth exploring linguistically or culturally, giving them a few minutes to post about that. It really gets them thinking, reflecting, wondering, and getting up and moving around, activating those kinesthetic skills as well. And here are some different resources I wanted to share. Lots of resources that are available really for inquiry-based learning that you can explore, all kinds of materials that it's really something, it's like opening a window. There is a world of possibilities out there with what can be used and how it can be used, and really getting our students to ask more questions, because this is really what we want. We want them to, this is what's stimulating to me, is when students are asking questions. I had a student once ask me, for example, we were talking a little bit about the colonization in Latin America. This was a Spanish class, and how so many of the Native American population was killed, but what else was killed? The one student asked me about the languages that were lost, and actually asked me about the languages. Okay, since so many people learned English, how about the Spanish or the conquerors? Did they learn any of the Native American languages? So then we actually started talking about language evolution, and how, for example, how did the word hurricane, think of the word hurricane, and why is the word hurricane only used in North America? And the rest of the world, it is typhoon or something else. Hurricane is only a North American term. And it actually comes from the Taino word. The Taino was the Native American population that was on the island of Hispaniola, or current day Dominican Republic and Haiti, and Cuba as well back then. So this is a word that was taken from the Taino population, which was then adapted to the Spanish, huracán, and today we have hurricane in English. So just to give you an idea, what one question can actually teach a whole class about where, what are we learning about? Where are we getting our words from? Our history. It's really cool. The Right Question Institute, I really want a big shout out to them because they're the ones who developed the QFT. And I really suggest and encourage to get on their mailing list. They have a lot of interesting events coming up. Some of them are free, which is always nice. Actually, Warren Berger is going to be hosting one of them for as well, a webinar that's coming up. So I really do encourage you all to take a look at these resources. And here's that book again by Warren Berger. Here's some of my own resources for academic resources for this particular presentation. And, really the thing is we want to make sure that we are constantly keeping the goal in mind, right? It's not just, we don't want just the child in pursuit of curiosity. We want always the questions to be coming. It's not curiosity in pursuit of the child, but we want it to be the other way around. And hopefully as they grow up, not just when they're children. And it's no wonder that the Socratic method has began with Socrates, because he's the one who's so well known for saying that wisdom begins in wonder. I just really wanted to end with this one because it is this is just one of my favorite quotes. We want to make sure that we are keeping those questions alive, no matter how old we are. The more that we can engage our students to wonder about the language that they're learning, how it connects to their world, and the more motivated that they're going to be and practice it, leading it to language proficiency, and of course, global citizenship. So if you're curious to learn more, this is how I can be reached. Here's my email. There's also a Facebook community I've started for curious educators. So feel free to join that as well. It's a great group of educators sharing different inquiry-related resources for all languages. And I'm open to any questions at this point. I think we're good on time.
Yes, absolutely we are. Thank you so much, Christina, for a very inspiring talk. I know I took lots of notes, lots of great resources. Would you mind going back real quick to your references slide? I wanted to see that again to all the...
This one?
That one right there, yep. If you can leave that up, that would be wonderful. So at this point, we're opening it up for questions. If you are on Zoom and have a question, you can use the raise hand feature. You can also put the question in chat. I don't know if anybody here in the physical audience has any questions. So if there is anything that you would like to get some clarification on or want to know of Christina, here is your chance.
I'm going through the chat to see if there's any questions.
And you certainly presented a lot of information, so that's a lot to take in. many great resources and I think ideas of what we can do in our classrooms. Christina, have you incorporated any of these ideas or activities outside of the K-12? I mean, I know that you've been teaching in Athens for a while now. Have you done any of this with adult learners too?
Can I stop sharing now or no?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
So I have, so not recently, because in Greece, I have not been involved in higher education aside from my own coursework through my Ph.D. But I am very much looking forward to, I'm hoping to start teaching with a university here with one course, for example, and I would like to definitely use these with the adult education as well. I did teach back in Baltimore. I also taught part-time at the community college level through their continuing education department. And although back then I hadn't gotten into the whole research with inquiry, but it's always been an important part of my life. So it is something that I definitely like to develop further, no matter what age group I'm with. And also one of the, I don't know if I mentioned before, outside of school, I also teach at a private language school, but I teach English through philosophical inquiry. It's called deeper learning. It's a deeper learning approach for language learning. And with this particular group, they're 18-year-olds or 17, 18-year-olds. So they've already reached like C1 proficiency. They've gotten their proficiency in English, but they want to further and to keep practicing the English. So this is really nice to be able to work with them as well. And it's basically, we choose a topic. My topic, for example, this year is on beauty. So we're really looking at all kinds of, through like an anthropological lens, let's say, of what beauty is and what does it mean to society and how they approach it, and the media and so forth. So it's really interesting to be able to, of course, this philosophical inquiry, and this is really what we want. This is how we're trying to get our students, the younger age, to start thinking those critical thinking skills, which gets them into those philosophical questions later on.
Yeah. I'm wondering too, some of the examples, and Isabel, and then we'll move over to you. Some of the examples you gave us focus specifically on cultural practices. Mm-hmm. Have you ever been in a situation where you maybe some of the questions that students were asking were drifting into stereotypes? And if that happened, how did you deal with that in the classroom? How did you steer away from, notions of attaching certain visuals or certain practices to a culture that really isn't reflective of what the target culture is?
So it's interesting because, okay, in Greece, we don't have it's not an issue, let's say. We're not, I don't think that the students that we have here are as exposed, let's say, to a lot of what's going on in the US right now, as far as talking about different things with regards to, lots of things going on now, I think, in the States that I like to actually ask them about and talk about. But as far as getting what's important to me is letting them understand, that they are going to see, for example, different pictures. For example, I showed them a picture the other day. We were talking about beauty. This is in the philosophical inquiry class. We looked at Dorothy Lang's The Migrant Mother. And I just asked them to look at the picture and what did they see? And, they described it in how they could. And, then we were able to really look at this as, okay, what did she do? One of the things that she did is actually look at the ugly part of America, but she made it beautiful in her own way as a photographer. And we were able to see and discuss those aspects of, okay, when we're looking at a culture, and then take it into their own culture. Okay, show me examples of ugliness, let's say, in the culture, but in a beautiful way. So it's getting them to think about things differently and being aware of that and talk about it and open the discussion for that, so that there is no judgment and there's no criticism. We're speaking and debating, we're discussing civilly. And I think this is what's most important. Okay, they can get quite heated in debates, for example, but it's important to just, let's make sure, okay, we're not going to listen if there's yelling, we're going to listen if we're speaking normally. And this is how we're going to hear each other out. And so when we hear students, for example, getting, you hear so much, oh, that's racist as a joke. It's not even real. They're just calling those terms out. And okay, let's revisit that. Is this really racist? Does this have that? Is this validated, for example. I mean, let's make sure, let's be conscious of what we're saying and how we're using the language that we're using. So it's, you know, we have to get them to start rethinking. Another great book I want to mention, which I didn't put in the presentation, it's called Think Again. It's just published recently in 21 by Adam Grant, I believe. It's just getting, I think all educators should read this. It's, you know, getting students to, not students, everyone, think again. Let's think again about what it is that we know, to understand what it is that we don't know, so that we can talk about it in a civil way.
Great, thank you. So we have one question here from the audience. I'm going to hand the mic over to Isabel.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Christina, for your presentation. And I'm excited to try out some of the other examples you've been given, of which there were many in your presentation. So thank you so much. A lot of inspiring input from you. And my question revolves around when I first tried what I had learned from you in my classroom. It was in an intermediate classroom. And of course, the students already had quite a diverse repertoire of vocabulary, and also were able to formulate quite complex questions. So my question now is, what tips and experiences do you have implementing this technique into beginners language language classes? And if there are any tips and experiences you have in basically adapting this technique for different levels?
So, okay, so I've done this in a level 1 Spanish classroom, for example, okay, like especially when we talk about the cultural things like, Day of the Dead, for example, in the Spanish classroom. And when they really have very, very little language input already. So they really don't know much, especially when, and Day of the Dead is end of October, and they've only had 2 months of school. So, we basically, so, you know, I will, obviously I'm going to use English, but also I'm going to gesticulate as much as I can. Okay, I'm going to show and point out the different words and visuals, storytelling through questioning, and really just drawing a lot, drawing on the board, or I do this I can't draw virtually, I just can't. But basically, you know, just showing them visuals and walking them through the process. And like when we're talking about open versus closed, like actually show them open versus, you know, abierta, cerrada, right? And like actually showing them and then repeating it all the time, comprehensible input, you know, in a way. So it's really, the more repetitions, the more, of course, you're going to use English as well. And you're going to need to, I mean, that's part of it. But it's really just, you stick to as much of the language as you can, and you explain as much as you can in the language, and translate when you need to, or have another student translate, right, if they can, and fill in the blanks that way as well.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. So we're at our time. Please all help me in thanking Christina for a wonderful presentation, very thought-provoking. And yep, applause, applause, applause.
Thank you.
And do stay tuned for a podcast episode with her on this topic as well. And we also, of course, always invite you to come for the remainder of our series. The next talk is actually a month from today, March 15th, by a colleague here from Cornell on a bilingual, bicultural language cafe. So that should be an interesting presentation as well. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Thank you again, Christina, and we look forward to seeing all of you for our next event. Thank you.